Imagine the sickest thing ever, using your job to take advantage of people who can't even defend themselves. It is the ultimate betrayal of trust, and when it happens to folks with disabilities, it's somehow worse. They are already dealing with so much, it's incredible some people would target them precisely for this reason, for being useless, in Satoshi's words. Tragically, the red flags were waving, but nobody paid attention or took Satoshi's words seriously, so he just kept on working with vulnerable people day after day. The story of what ended up going down is going to make your blood run cold. It is a harsh wake-up call about what can happen when the system fails the people it is supposed to protect. Brace yourselves, because this one is heavy. The residents of the Tsuki Yumirean Care in Shanghai, Japan, had no way of knowing their lives were about to be forever altered that fateful July night in 2016. Nor did they have a way to defend themselves. They were unarmed, in bed, and vulnerable. That's why they were inside a mental health care facility. 150 patients ranging from just 19 to 70 years old were settling into their beds at the Yumirean Care Facility, ready for a peaceful night's sleep. Little did they know, an unthinkable nightmare was about to shatter their world. It was around 2:10 a.m. on July 26th when a shadowy figure crept onto the grounds, slipping through a window with a bag of knives and a hammer. The residents and staff had no idea that this intruder was Satoshi Uematsu, a 26-year-old former employee. By the time they recognized him, it was too late. For 40 minutes, he went on a brutal stabbing rampage, moving from room to room without mercy. He slashed the throats of helpless victims as they lay in their beds, unable to comprehend the horror unfolding around them. Blood soaked the floors, and the once quiet halls echoed with the chilling screams of the wounded. It was like a scene from a horror movie, but this was all too real. By the time he fled into the early morning darkness, the extent of the damage was staggering. 19 lives had been violently cut short, and 25 more were left fighting for survival. An entire nation was left reeling, struggling to come to terms with the devastating reality that this was the worst mass killing in Japan's recent history. The sheer brutality of his actions sent shockwaves through the community. In a matter of minutes, he had shattered the sense of peace and security that so many had taken for granted. It was a grim reminder that even in a country known for its safety, evil could strike in the most horrific and unspeakable ways. The brutality of his rampage was even more horrifying because of who his targets were. Yumirean was a place for people with all sorts of mental and physical disabilities, a group that often gets sidelined and hidden away in Japanese society. Many of the residents couldn't fully understand what was happening to them, let alone fight back against their attacker. They were completely vulnerable, which just made his actions feel that much more cruel and sickening.
This wasn't an impulsive crime where the suspect just blew up and grabbed a knife. He went in the dead of night, opened one door at a time, and stabbed sleeping people one at a time.
Satoshi handed himself in at a local police station hours later. He showed zero remorse about what he'd done. He just wanted to get it over with. As the country tried to make sense of this senseless violence, people started learning more about the 26-year-old man behind it. To the people in his life, Satoshi didn't seem like the kind of person who could do something so awful. His neighbors described him as friendly and outgoing, and he'd been a great employee at Tsuki Yumiere from 2012 until he left in early 2016. Everyone thought he had a really bright future ahead of him, but beneath that nice guy exterior, he was hiding some seriously dark and twisted thoughts. He wasn't born in Sagamihara, where he committed his worst atrocity. He was born in Tokyo, Japan's capital, 40 kilometers away from Sagamihara. Born in January 1990 to an elementary school teacher dad and a cartoonist mom, Satori moved to Sagamihara as a baby. As a child, he did okay. He was more the funny kid than the academically gifted one, but no one had complaints about him. However, as a teenager, he became defiant and aggressive, much to his parents' dismay. They received reports of him shoplifting, destroying property, and even kicking a disabled person who was standing in his way to school. Yeah, that's how far back his hatred for the disabled went, and yet he was allowed to work at a mental health care facility. Satori majored in primary education, but around this time his parents moved back to Tokyo, leaving Satori alone in his family home. According to some sources, they left him simply because his behavior was driving them insane, and they didn't know what to do anymore. He was an adult. He was on his own, they said. Around this time, Satoshi tattooed his whole back. And before you ask why this is relevant to the story, we must remember this is happening in Japan. In Japan, tattoos have been long associated with criminality, particularly the Yakuza or the Japanese mafia. This stigma dates back centuries when tattoos were used to brand and punish lawbreakers. Today, many businesses such as public baths and gyms still ban people with tattoos. Japanese society highly values conformity and fitting in. By tattooing his entire back, Satoshi deliberately chose to rebel against societal norms. His tattoo symbolized a rejection of traditional Japanese values and a desire to stand out, which is heavily frowned upon in Japanese culture. This act of defiance likely contributed to the rift between Yumatsu and his family, as it brought shame to them. Months after graduating from college in 2012, Satoshi completed a social welfare qualification and got a job at the Tsuzuki Yominuri Care Facility. But Satori hid his views on disabled people from the board who hired him. You see, he believed that disabled people's lives weren't as valuable as everyone else's. In his mind, they were a burden on society. He actually thought that if someone couldn't live on their own and contribute to the economy, they were better off being put to death. Let that sink in for a second. He worked as a caregiver for disabled people, but he secretly wanted them dead. That is the kind of messed up thinking that took him from being a supposed helper to a cold-blooded killer. As disgusting as his beliefs were, they didn't come out of nowhere. They were a more extreme version of prejudices against disabled people that have existed in Japan for a long time. Japanese culture puts a lot of emphasis on fitting in and being productive, so people with physical or mental disabilities can face a ton of stigma and discrimination. They often get pushed to the edges of society with limited chances to participate fully in things like school or work. The stigma is so strong that a lot of families feel like they have to hide their disabled relatives away because it's seen as shameful. It gets worse. Over 25,000 disabled citizens in Japan have been sterilized since 1945, with over 16,000 of those sterilizations performed entirely against their will. This shocking practice aimed at purifying the Japanese population was only officially abolished in 1996. But it's easy to imagine how many people kept these hateful beliefs afterward. Sadly, hateful mindsets disappear at much slower rates than the laws meant to keep them in check. In a society like that, it's sadly not surprising that someone like Yumatsu could develop such toxic and harmful attitudes. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it shows how bad things can get when prejudice is allowed to fester. The saddest part is that there were warning signs about what he was planning, but no one took them seriously until it was too late. His superiors at the facility saw him hit patients at least twice. When they confronted him about it, he had a lame excuse and promised not to do it again. In the end, he was the one who resigned in February 2016. Just a few months before the attack, Satoshi hand-delivered a letter to one of Japan's most powerful politicians, the House of Representatives Speaker. In this letter, he straight up said he wanted to unalive hundreds of disabled people.
There were plenty of warning signs. Uematsu had begun to publicly express his disturbing view that disabled people unable to live independent lives should be killed.
He made it seem like he'd be doing society a favor, like he could save the country from economic problems by getting rid of people he saw as a burden. It was a really messed up and twisted logic. Of course, the letter got him arrested right away, and he was sent to a psychiatric hospital to get checked out. But here's the really shocking part. Only 2 weeks later, the doctors let him go. They apparently thought he wasn't a danger to himself or others anymore. Looking back, it was a catastrophic mistake that ended up costing so many lives. Even though he never took back what he said about wanting to hurt people, the authorities just kind of let it go. They didn't do anything else to keep an eye on him or make sure he wouldn't act on his threats. And then on that awful night in July, he proved that he meant every word he'd written. People were left in shock, wondering if they could have done more to prevent this tragedy.
When I walked there, the staff and tenants were like friends. I just can't imagine this happening.
One woman in Tokyo spoke to the police on the day after the attack. It turns out she had met Satoshi at a barbecue restaurant for dinner the night before the attack. He was pretty weird. He'd dyed his hair a messy yellow, he showed her his hateful letter, and he promised to unalive disabled people. And yet, she thought he was just a weirdo, a bark and no bite type of person. Of course, Satoshi's crimes are not on her, but it's shocking how many people ignored this walking, talking red flag before it was too late. In the horrific aftermath of Yumatsu's attack, the families of the victims rushed to the care facility, desperate for information about their loved ones. Some had to face the worst news imaginable, while others had to endure an agonizing wait to find out if their family members would survive their injuries. And to make the situation even more painful, the authorities were super slow to give out any information. The families had to wait a whole 10 days after the massacre before they started getting any real updates. It's hard to imagine how traumatic that must have been, to be kept in the dark for so long after something so devastating. As Japan tried to come to grips with the worst mass killing since the 1995 Tokyo sarin gas attacks and the 2008 Akihabara stabbings, some really unsettling things about the official response started coming to light. Get this, not a single government official or major news outlet called the stabbings what they were: a hate crime against disabled people. And you know what else? The authorities never even released the names of the 19 people killed to the public. Apparently, most of the families were afraid that if everyone found out their loved ones had disabilities, it would bring shame and judgment. It's like the victims were being erased, all because of the stigma around disability in Japan. When Utamazo finally stood trial, it was chilling to see how completely remorseless he was for taking 19 lives. Despite all the evidence against him, he had the nerve to plead not guilty, and he doubled down on his sickening belief that disabled people don't deserve a place in society. In this bizarre attempt to show remorse, he even bit off his own finger in front of the court, but not once did he take back his absolutely vile views. Sure, he got a death sentence in March 2020, and that's a small measure of justice, but it doesn't even begin to undo the immense harm and suffering he caused. The Sagamihara massacre is a horrifying wake-up call about the catastrophic damage that unchecked ableism and hatred can do. It's the ultimate example of how society can dehumanize and deny the basic rights of people who are already marginalized and pushed to the sidelines in Japan. But we can't let the 19 lives lost at the Tsukuyoku Yumarian be in vain. Their memories should light a fire under us to confront the deep-rooted prejudices and obstacles that the disabled community faces every single day. We've got to come together and build a society of true equality and empowerment. In 2023, a singer named Miyuki Sakai spoke about how the massacre still resonates today. Her daughter was born with Down syndrome, and her grandfather refused to acknowledge her.
He concealed it from his friends and acquaintances and kept his distance from the girl. That all changed when the father-in-law himself became almost totally paralyzed in an accident that damaged his spinal cord. Unable to speak, he could only move his face and hands. That was when he began asking to see his granddaughter.
Miyuki said, "I believe he was finally able to accept the disability of his granddaughter when he accepted his own disability." Do you have to become disabled to accept another disabled person? There is only one answer to this: no. We need to create a world where diversity is something to be celebrated, not shamed. A world where support, inclusion, and opportunities for disabled people aren't just a nice bonus, but a non-negotiable. We need stronger protections for the most vulnerable among us, and we can't wait around for something bad to happen before we step in. We've got to be proactive about addressing red flags, whether it's signs of mental instability or hate speech. And when it comes to ableism in any shape or form, we need a zero-tolerance policy, period. It is on all of us to make sure that the Sagamihara tragedy is a turning point, not just another sad chapter in history. This is the crucial mission we have to take on in the wake of this senseless July night. We owe it to the precious lives that were stolen to fight back against the prejudices that allow such unthinkable things to happen. It's going to take major changes to the system, but it also demands that each and every one of us look inside ourselves and change how we think about and treat people with disabilities in our own lives. If there is anything remotely positive we can take from the horror of Sagamihara, let it be a fire in our hearts to stand up to ableism wherever it rears its ugly head and fight for those who are too often left on the margins. Let's keep the unnamed victim's memory alive by pouring our hearts into creating a world where a tragedy like this never happens again. A world where hate like Satoshi Yumatsu's has nowhere to take root. Hey, thanks for watching. Do you know any similar cases outside of Japan? What are your thoughts on curbing hateful crimes like these? Leave a comment, and before you leave, make sure you like and subscribe. Catch you soon, yeah?